Chapter 6. Death has this much to be said for it. You don't have to get out of bed for it. Wherever you happen to be, they bring it to you free. Kingsley Amis. Pointed threats. They bluff with scorn. Suicide remarks are torn from the fool's gold mouthpiece, the hollow born. Plays wasted words, proves to warn that he not busy being born is busy dying. Bob Dylan, it's all right, Ma. I'm only bleeding. When it came to it, and old Kingsley suffered from a demoralizing and disorienting fall, he did take to his bed and eventually turned his face to the wall. It wasn't all reclining and waiting for hospital room service after that. Kill me, you fucking fool, he once alarmingly exclaimed to his son Philip, but essentially he waited passively for the end. It duly came, without much fuss and with no charge. Mr. Robert Zimmerman of Hibbing, Minnesota, has had at least one very close encounter with death, more than one update and revision of his relationship with the Almighty and the four last things, and looks to set to go on demonstrating that there are many different ways of proving that one is alive. After all, considering the alternatives, before I was diagnosed with esophageal cancer, a year and a half ago, I rather jauntily told the readers of my memoirs that when faced with extinction, I wanted to be fully conscious and awake in order to do death in the active and not the passive sense. And I do still try to nurture that little flame of curiosity and defiance, willing to play out the string to the end and wishing to be spared nothing that properly belongs to a lifespan. However, one thing that grave illness does is to make you examine familiar principles and seemingly reliable sayings. And there's one that I find I am not saying with quite the same conviction as I once used to. In particular, I have slightly stopped issuing the announcement that whatever doesn't kill me makes me stronger. In fact, I now sometimes wonder why I ever thought of it. Profound. It is usually attributed to Friedrich Nietzsche. Was mich nicht umbringt, macht mich stärker. In German, it reads and sounds more like poetry, which is why it seems probable to me that Nietzsche borrowed it from Goethe, who was writing a century earlier. But does the rhyme suggest a reason? Perhaps it does, or can, in matters of the emotions. I can remember thinking of testing moments involving love and hate that I had, so to speak, come out of them ahead with some strength accrued from the experience that I couldn't have acquired in any other way. And then once or twice, walking away from a car wreck or a close encounter with mayhem while doing foreign reporting, I experienced a rather fatuous feeling of having been toughened by the encounter. But really, that's to say no more than, there but for the grace of God go I, which in turn is to say no more than the grace of God has happily embraced me and skipped that unfortunate other man. In the brute physical world and the one encompassed by medicine, there are all too many things that could kill you, don't kill you, and then leave you considerably weaker. Nietzsche was destined to find this out in the hardest possible way, which makes it additionally perplexing that he chose to include the maxim in his 1889 anthology, Twilight of the Idols. In German, this is rendered as Götterdämmerung, which contains a clear echo of Wagner's epic. possibly his great quarrel with the composer, in which he recoiled with horror from Wagner's repudiation of the classics in favor of German blood myths and legends, was one of the things that did lend Nietzsche moral strength and fortitude. Certainly, the book's subtitle, How to Philosophize with a Hammer, has plenty of bravado. In the remainder of his life, however, Nietzsche seems to have caught an early dose of syphilis, very probably during his first ever sexual encounter, which gave him crushing migraine headaches and attacks of blindness and metastasized into dementia and paralysis. This, while it did not kill him right away, certainly contributed to his death and cannot possibly, in the meanwhile, be said to have made him stronger. In the course of his mental decline, he became convinced that the most important possible cultural feat would be to prove that the plays of Shakespeare had been written by Bacon. This is an unfailing sign of advanced intellectual and mental prostration. I take a slight interest in this because not long ago I was invited onto a Christian radio station in deepest Dixie to debate religion. My interviewer maintained a careful Southern courtesy throughout, always allowing me enough time to speak my points, and then surprised me by inquiring if I regarded myself as in any sense a Nietzschean. I replied in the negative, saying that I had agreed with some arguments put forward by the great man, but didn't owe any large insight to him, and found his contempt for democracy to be somewhat off-putting. H.L. Mencken and others I tried to add had also used him to argue some crude social Darwinist points about the pointlessness of aiding the unfit. And his frightful sister Elizabeth had exploited his decline to misuse his work as if it had been written in support of the German anti-Semitic nationalist movement. This had perhaps given Nietzsche an undeserved posthumous reputation as a fanatic. The questioner pressed on, asking if I knew that much of Nietzsche's work had been produced while he was decaying from terminal syphilis. I again responded that I had heard this and knew of no reason to doubt it, though I knew of no confirmation either. Just as it became too late, and I heard the strains of music and the words that this would be all we would have time for, my host stole a march and wondered how much of my own writing on God had perhaps been influenced by a similar malady. I should have seen this gotcha coming, but it was left wordless. Eventually, and in miserable circumstances, in the Italian city of Turin, Nietzsche was overwhelmed at the sight of a horse being cruelly beaten in the street. Rushing to throw his arms around the animal's neck, he suffered some terrible seizure and seems, for the rest of his pain-racked and haunted life, to have been under the care of his mother and sister. The date of the Turin trauma is potentially interesting. It occurred in 1889, and we know that in 1887, Nietzsche had been powerfully influenced by his discovery of the works of Dostoevsky. There appears to be an almost eerie correspondence between the episode in the street and the awful graphic dream experienced by Raskolnikov on the night before he commits the decisive murders in Crime and Punishment. The nightmare, which is quite impossible to forget once you have read it, involves the terribly prolonged beating to death of a horse. Its owner scourges it across the eyes, smashes its spine with a pole, calls on bystanders to help with the flogging. We are spared nothing. If the gruesome coincidence was enough to bring about Nietzsche's final unhingement, then he must have been tremendously weakened or made appallingly vulnerable by his other unrelated sufferings. These then by no means serve to make him stronger. The most he could have meant, I now think, is that he made the most of his few intervals from pain and madness to set down his collections of penetrating aphorism and paradox. This may have given him the euphoric impression that he was triumphing and that making use of the will to power. Twilight of the Idols was actually published almost simultaneously with the horror of Interin, so the coincidence was pushed as far as it could reasonably go. Or take an example from an altogether different and more temperate philosopher nearer to our own time. The late Professor Sidney Hook was a famous materialist and pragmatist who wrote sophisticated treatises that synthesized the work of John Dewey and Karl Marx. He too was an unrelenting atheist. Toward the end of his long life, he became seriously ill and began to reflect on the paradox that, based as he was in the medical mecca of Stanford, California, he was able to avail himself of a historically unprecedented level of care, while at the same time being exposed to a degree of suffering that previous generations might not have been able to afford. Reasoning on this after one especially horrible experience from which he had eventually recovered, he decided that he would, after all, rather have died. I lay at the point of death. A congestive heart failure was treated for diagnostic purposes by the angiogram that triggered a stroke. Violent and painful hiccups, uninterrupted for several days and nights, prevented the ingestion of food. My left side and one of my vocal cords became paralyzed. Some form of pleurisy set in, and I felt I was drowning in a sea of slime. In one of my lucid intervals during those days of agony, I asked my physician to discontinue all life supporting services or show me how to do it. Well, the physician denied this plea rather loftily, assuring Hook that someday I would appreciate the unwisdom of my request. But the Stoic philosopher, from the vantage point of continued life, still insisted that he wished he had been permitted to expire. He gave three reasons. Another agonizing stroke could hit him, forcing him to suffer it all over again. His family was being put through a hellish experience. Medical resources were being pointlessly expended. In the course of his essay, he used a potent phrase to describe the position of others who suffer like this, referring to them as lying on the mattresses' graves. If being restored to life doesn't count as something that doesn't kill you, then what does? And yet, there seems no meaningful sense in which it made Sidney Hook stronger. Indeed, if anything, it seems to have concentrated his attention on the way in which each debilitation builds on its predecessor and becomes one cumulative misery with only one possible outcome. After all, if it were otherwise, then each attack, each stroke, each vile hiccup, each slime assault would collectively build up and strengthen resistance. And this is plainly absurd. So we are left with something quite unusual in the annals of unsentimental approaches to extinction. Not the wish to die with dignity, but the desire to have died. Professor Hook eventually left us in 1989, and I am a generation younger than him. I haven't sailed as close to the bitter end as he had to do, nor have I yet had to think of having such an arduous conversation with a physician. But I do remember lying there and looking down at my naked torso, which was covered almost from throat to navel by a vivid red radiation rash. This was the product of a month-long bombardment with protons, which had burned all away all of the cancer in my clavicular and peritracheal nodes, as well as the original tumor in the esophagus. This put me in a rare class of patients who could claim to have received the highly advanced expertise uniquely available at the stellar zip code of MD Anderson Cancer Center in Houston. To say the rash hurt would be pointless. The struggle is to convey the way that it hurt on the inside. I lay for days on end, trying to, in vain, to postpone the moment when I would have to swallow. Every time I did swallow, a hellish tide of pain would follow up my throat, culminating in what felt like a mule kick in the small of my back. I wondered if things looked as red and inflamed within as they did without. And unprompted rogue, when I had an unprompted rogue thought, if I had been told about all of this in advance, would I have opted for the treatment? There were several moments as I bucked and writhed and gasped and cursed when I seriously doubted it. It's probably a merciful thing that pain is impossible to describe from memory. It's also impossible to warn against. If my proton doctors had tried to tell me up front, they might perhaps have spoken of grave discomfort or perhaps of a burning sensation. I only know that nothing at all could have readied or steadied me for this thing that seemed to scorn painkillers and to attack me in my core. I now seem to have run out of radiation options in those spots. 35 straight days being considered as much as anyone can take. And while this isn't in any way good news, it spares me from having to wonder if I could willingly endure the same course of treatment again. But mercifully, too, I now can't summon the memory of how I felt during those lacerating days and nights, and I've had some intervals of relative robustness. So, as a rational actor, taking the radiation together with the reaction and the recovery, I have to agree that if I had declined the first stage, thus avoiding the second and third, I would already be dead. And this has no appeal. However, there is no escaping the fact that I am otherwise enormously weaker than I was then. How long ago it seemed that I presented the proton team with champagne and then hopped almost nimbly into a taxi. During my next hospital stay in Washington, D.C., the institution gifted me with a vicious staph pneumonia and sent me home twice with it. That almost snuffed me out. The annihilation fatigue, the annihilating fatigue that came over me in consequence also contained the deadly threat of surrender to the inescapable. I would often find fatalism and resignation washing drearily over me as I failed to battle my general inanition. Only two things rescued me from betraying myself and letting go. A wife who would not hear of me talking in this boring and useless way, and various friends who also spoke freely. Oh, and the regular painkiller. How happily I measured off my day as I saw the injection being readied. It counted as a real event. With some analgesics, if you are lucky, you can actually feel the hit as it goes in. A sort of warming tingle with an idiotic bliss to it. To have come to this, like the sad goons who raid pharmacies over Oxycontin, but it was an alleviation of boredom and guilty pleasure, not many of those in Tumor Town, and not least in a relief from pain. In my English family, the role of national poet was taken not by Philip Larkin, but by John Bedgeman, bard of suburbia and the middle class, and a much more mordant presence than the rather teddy bearish figure he sometimes presented to the world. His poem of 5 o'clock Shadow shows him at his least furry. This is the time of day when we in the men's ward think one more surge of the pain and I give up the fight. When he who struggles for breath can struggle less strongly, this is the time of day that is worse than night. I've come to know that feeling all right, the sensation and conviction that the pain will never go away and that the wait for the next fix is unjustly long. Then a sudden fit of breathlessness followed by some pointless coughing, and then, if it's a lousy day, by more expectoration than I can handle. Pints of old saliva, occasionally mucus, and what the hell do I need heartburn for at this exact moment? It's not as if I have eaten anything. A tube delivers all my nourishment. All this and the childish resentment that goes with it constitutes a weakening. So does the amazing weight loss that the tube seems unable to combat. I have now lost almost a third of my body mass since the cancer was diagnosed. It may not kill me, but the atrophy of muscle makes it harder to even take the simple exercises without which I'll become more enfeebled still. I am typing this having just had an injection to try to reduce the pain in my arms, hands, and fingers. The chief side effects of this pain is numbness in the extremities, filling me with the not irrational fear that I shall lose the ability to write. Without that ability, I feel sure in advance my will to live will be hugely attenuated. I often grandly say that writing is not just my living and my livelihood, but my very life, and it's true, almost like the threatened loss of my voice, which is currently being alleviated by some temporary injections into my vocal folds. I feel that my personality and identity dissolving as I contemplate dead hands and the loss of transmission belts that connect me to writhing and thinking. These are progressive weaknesses that in a more normal life might have been taken decades to catch up with me. But as with the normal life, one finds that every passing day represents more and more relentlessly subtracted from less and less. In other words, the process both annihilates you and moves you nearer towards death. How could it be otherwise? Just as I was beginning to reflect along these lines, I came across an article of the treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder. We now know from dearly bought experience much more about this malady than we used to. Apparently, one of the symptoms by which it is made known is that a tough veteran will say, seeking to make light of his experience, that what didn't kill me made me stronger. This is one of the manifestations that denial takes. I am attracted to the German etymology of the word stark and its relative use by Nietzsche. Starker, which means stronger. In Yiddish, to call someone a starker is to credit him with being a militant, a rough guy, a tough guy, a hard worker. So far, I have decided to take whatever my disease can throw at me and to stay combative even while taking the measure of my inevitable decline. I repeat, this is no more than what a healthy person has to do in a slower motion. It is our common fate. In either case, though, one can dispense with facile maxims that don't live up to their apparent billing. I may have made one exception to my emerging rule that Nietzsche was to be distrusted, or to my pretense to myself that I had resources that I may not have truly possessed. A good deal of cancer life has to do with the blood, of which cancer is indeed the particular malady. A sufferer will find himself giving quite a quantity of the fluid, either to facilitate the opening of a catheter or to help test the levels of blood sugar and other material. For years, I have found it absurdly easy to undergo routine blood tests. I would walk in, sit down, endure a brief squeeze from a tourniquet until a usable vein became available or accessible, and then a single small stab would allow the filling of the relevant little tubes and syringes. Over time, however, this ceased to be one of the pleasurable highlights of the medicalized day. The phlebotomist would sit down, take my hand on the wrist in his or her hand, and sigh. The welts of reddish and purple could already be seen giving the arm a definite junky look. The veins themselves lay sunken in their beds, either hollow or crushed. Very occasionally, they would cooperate with a junkie-based strategy that consisted of slowly smacking them with a taut fingertip. But this seldom yielded a robust result. Large swellings would occur, usually just near the elbow or wrist joint, or anywhere they would do the least good. In addition, one had to stop pretending that the business was effectively painless. No more the jauntily talk of one little pinch. It doesn't actually hurt that much to have a probing needle inserted for a second time. No, what hurts is having it moved to and from in the hopes that it can properly penetrate the vein and release the needle fluid. And the more this is done, the more it hurts. This illustrates the whole business in microcosm, the battle against cancer, reduced to a struggle to get a few drops of gore out of a large, warm mammal that cannot provide them. Please believe me when I say that one quickly comes to sympathize with the technicians. They are proud of their work and do not regularly and they are they are proud of their work and do not enjoy imposing discomfort. Indeed, they will regularly and with relief give place to another volunteer or submit to another's expertise. But the job has to be done, and there is dismay when it can't be completed. I was recently scheduled for the insertion of a PIC line, which by means of which a permanent blood catheter is inserted in the upper arm so that the need for repeated temporary invasions can be obviated. The experts told me that this seldom took more than 10 minutes to complete, which had been my own experience on previous visits. It can't have been much less than 2 hours until, having tried and failed with both arms, I was lying between two bed pads that were liberally laced with dried or clotting blood. The upset of the nurses was palpable, and we were further off from a solution. As this kind of thing becomes more common, I began to take on the role of morale booster. When the technician would offer to stop, I would urge her to go on and assure her that I sympathized. I would relate the number of attempts made on previous occasions in order to spur greater efforts. My self image was that of a plucky English immigrant rising above the agony of a little needle stick. Whatever didn't kill me, I averred, would make me stronger. I think this began to pall on the day that I had to ask to keep going through 11 sessions and was secretly hoping for the chance to give up and go to sleep. Then suddenly the worried face of the expert cleared at once as he exclaimed, "Well, 12 times is the charm." And the life-giving thread began to unspool in the syringe. From this time on, it seemed absurd to affect the idea that this bluffing on my part was making me stronger, or making other people perform more strongly or cheerfully either. Whatever view one takes of the outcome being affected by morale, it seems certain that the realm of illusion must be escaped before anything else. Chapter 7. Not many weeks ago, I was starting a bedridden day in a state of acute powerlessness and quite rough pain. As I lay unable to move but braced from past experience, I heard a soothing and capable voice saying, "Now you might feel just a little prick. Be assured, male patients have exhausted all the possibilities of this feeble joke within the first few days of hearing it." And almost at once, I felt reassured in a different way, because that voice and that expression and that little pang meant that the pain would lift and my limbs straighten and my day would begin. And so it proved. What if, though, as I once semi-consciously thought as I lay in similar distress, that friendly voice had just the faintest hint of a taunt in it? What if I had been saying, in the merest possible way, "This won't hurt much"? The whole balance of power would have been violently subverted, leaving me defenseless and petrified. I would also instantly have to wonder how long I would coexist with such a threat. The torturer's intricate work would have begun. I stress intricate because torture isn't really a matter of sheer brute pain and force. As I found out, I was actually a torture victim. It is above all a matter of subtle calibration. How are we doing today? Any discomfort? This is made additionally problematic by the tendency of modern medicine to fall back on the use of euphemistic words in any case. The polite evasion of the weak discomfort being one of the most salient of these. Another avenue of the euphemism is laid out by the planned and coordinated approach. Thus, one might hear the question, "Have you met with our pain management team yet?" Once you have heard it the wrong way, this can seem like an echo of a torturous practice. of showing to the victim that the instruments that will be used upon him, or describing the range of techniques and letting these threats do the main part of the job. Galileo Galilei was allegedly exposed to this while undergoing the graduated pressure that eventually squeezed him to recant. I became a torture victim because I wanted the readers of Vanity Fair to have an idea of what was involved in the sordid and obscure controversy about waterboarding. And the only way left or left untried was to offer myself to this procedure. Obviously, there were limitations to the authenticity of its infliction. And I had to be, in some sense, in control of the setting, but I was determined as far as possible to discover what waterboarded person really undergoes. With the help of some very serious former special forces personnel who knew that they were breaking American law on American soil, I arranged an appointment in the hills of North Carolina. Before we could even begin, I had signed a legal document indemnifying them in case they killed me by the infliction of physical psychological trauma. A stronger word there. What happens, you may have been told, is a simulation of the sensation of drowning. Wrong. What happens is that you are slowly but inexorably drowned. And if at any point you manage to evade the deadly drip of water, your torturer will know. He or she will then make a minute but effective adjustment. When I interviewed my torturers later, I was particularly interested in this aspect of matters. Oh, yes, they said with mild bragging, we have lots of little moves and shakes and twists that will get the job done and not leave a mark. Again, you note this pride and technique and its almost humanist tone of professional expression, the language of torturers. The reason I have decided to write about this in the present context is as follows. Ever since I composed and published the original essay, which was some time before I was diagnosed with esophageal cancer, I had been suffering from some form of post-torture stress that probably has yet to be classified or named. In my own case, at any rate, it has to do with asphyxiation, and the aspiration of moisture can trigger a flood of panic, and has become imbricated with the larger and deadlier symptoms of my various pneumonias. And every day I am forced to prepare myself to be tube fed through an apparatus of liquid nourishment, or to be washed to different degrees of immersion, or to be otherwise made highly vulnerable. So I am very fortunate indeed that I have never had to hear the torturer's odious whisper, or to shrink at the thought that I am only a wrinkle of a twist away from severe fear and distress, a word quite high on the euphemism scale. But I do now know how the trick could have been pulled. I've been cycled through various great American hospitals in the course of my experience, at least one of which is famous for being operated by a historic religious leader. In each of the rooms of this hospital, from no matter what perspective you lie in bed, the commanding view is decidedly that of a large black metal crucifix embedded tenaciously in the wall. I had no special objection to this on one level, because it really did little to more than repeat the name of the hospital itself. I tend not to pick my fights with the chaplain's departments until I have proper point to make. In Texas, for instance, in a purpose-built brand new facility that took the towers to the level of more than 2 dozen, I got them to agree in principle that it was slightly idiotic not to boast of a 13th floor, but instead to skip from 12 to 14. Surely nobody checks in here to complain of cosmic fears generated by a number, or would check out because of it. We seem incidentally quite unable to discern how this dank little superstition ever got started. However, I also happen to know that it was a practice during the wars of religion and campaigns of the Inquisition to subject condemned to a compulsory view of the cross until they had died. In some of the fervent paintings of the grand autos de fe, or acts of faith, not not I think excluding some of the burnings alive captured by Goya on the Plaza Mayor, we see the flame and the smoke arising from the vicinity of the victim. and then the cross itself held grimly aloft before his closing eyes. I have to say that even if this is now done only in a more palliative fashion, it makes me feel disapproving on the grounds of its earlier sadomasochistic associations. There are banal, quotidian hospital and medical practices that remind people of the state-sponsored torture. In my own case, there are also practices that I can't separate from the hell of earlier ones. Even the thought of some misapplications of water or gas, such as moisturized or nebulized breathing treatments kit, can be more than enough to make me feel critically ill. When I was first thinking of a possible title for this book, I considered annexing the line obscene as cancer from Wilfred Owen's terrifying poem about death on the Western Front, Dulce et decorum est. The action describes the reaction of a group of exhausted British stragglers caught in the open during a gas attack for which they are ill prepared. Gas! Gas! Quick, boys! An ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time. But someone still was yelling out and stumbling, and floundering like a man in fire or lime. Dim through the misty panes and thick green light, as under a green sea, I saw him drowning. In all my dreams, before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, and drowning. If in some smothering dreams you two could pace behind the wagon that we flung him in, and watch the white eyes writhing in his hanging face like a devil's sick sin. If you could hear at every jolt the blood come gargling from the froth, corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cud, of vile, incurable sores on innocent tongues. My friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory the old lie, dulcet et decorum est, pro patria mori. When I, too, am sometimes forced into premature awareness by smothering or choked nightmare sensation, I realized how essential it is that the frontier of medicine be so tightly and punctiliously patrolled. Punctiliously patrolled. I appreciate that within the profession itself, there be not the least concession to any relaxation of that standard. The operators of that famous hospital should be ashamed of the historic role played by their order in the appalling legalization of and application of torture. And I have the same right, if not duty, to be equally ashamed of the official policy of torture adopted by the government, whose citizenship papers I had only recently taken out. Chapter 8. Remember, you too are mortal. Hit me at the top of my form, and just as things were beginning to plateau. My two assets, my pen and my voice. And it had to be the esophagus. All along, while burning the candle at both ends, I'd been straying into the arena of the unwell, and now a vulgar little tumor was evident. This alien can't want anything. If it kills me, it dies, but it seems very single-minded and set in its purpose. No real irony here, though. Must take absolute care not to be self-pitying or self-centered. Publisher's note. These fragmentary jottings were left unfinished at the time of the author's death. Always prided myself on my reasoning faculty and my stoic materialism. I don't have a body, I am a body, yet consciously and regularly acted as if this was not true, or as if an exception would be made in my case. Feeling husky and tired on tour? See the doctor when it's over. Lost 14 pounds without trying. Thin at last. But don't feel lighter because walking to the fridge is like a forced march. Then again, the vicious psoriasis, eczema, pustules that no doctor could treat have gone too. This must be some impressive toxin I'm taking, and a mercy for sleep purposes. But all the sleep aids and blissful dozens seem somehow a waste of life. There's plenty of future time in which to be unconscious. The nice men with the oxygen and gurney and ambulance very gently deporting me across the frontier of the well in another country. The alien was burrowing into me even as I wrote the jaunty words about my own prematurely announced death. Now, so many tributes that it also seems that rumors of my life have also been greatly exaggerated. Lived to see most of what's going to be written about me. This too is exhilarating, but it hits diminishing returns when I realize how soon it too will be background. Julian Barnes on John Diamond. A bout de souffle. Seberg Belmondo. Funny how one uses breathless or out of breath so casually. At Logan Airport, can't breathe. Next stop, terminal. Tragedy? Wrong word. Hegel versus the Greeks. Morning of biopsy. Wake and say whatever happens. This is the last day of my old life. No pretense of youth or youthfulness anymore. From now on, an arduous awareness. New Yorker cartoon on obit pages used to notice death dates of Orwell, Wilde, etc. Now maybe as long as Evelyn Waugh. Amazing how heart and lungs and liver have held up. Would have been healthier if I'd been more sickly. Prayer. Interesting contradictions at the expense of those who offer it. Too easy. A Pascalian escape hatch with me on the right side of the wager this time. What God could ignore such supplications? Same token, those who say I am being punished are saying that God can't think of anything more vengeful than cancer for a heavy smoker. Nose hair's gone, runny nostrils, constipation, and diarrhea alternating. The old order changeth, yielding place to new, and God fulfills himself in many ways, and soon, I suppose, I shall be swept away by some vulgar little tumor. Some years ago, a British journalist, John Diamond, was diagnosed with cancer and turned his condition into a weekly column. Rightly, he maintained the same perky tone that characterized the rest of his work. Rightly, he admitted cowardice and panic alongside curiosity and occasional courage. His accounts sounded completely authentic. This was what living with cancer entailed, nor did being ill make you a different person or stop you having rows with your wife. Like many other readers, I used to quickly urge him on from week to week. But after a year and more, well, a certain narrative expectation inevitably built up. Hey, miracle cure. Hey, I was just having you on. No, neither of those could work as endings. Diamond had to die, and he duly, correctedly, in narrative terms, did. Though, how can I put this? A stern literary critic might complain that his story lacked compactness towards the end. Tendency of some commiserations to sound unintentionally final, either by past tense or some other giveaway of a valedictory sort, sending flowers not as nice as it might seem. I'm not fighting or battling cancer, it's fighting me. Brave? Ha! Save it for a fight you can't run away from. Sao Bello. Death is the dark backing that a mirror needs if we are able to see anything. Vertiginous feeling of being kicked forward in time, catapulted toward the finish line, trying not to think with my tumor, which would not be thinking at all. People try to make it sound as if it were an episode in one's life. Oncology, ontology. Under the old religious dispensation, heaven would simply sentence you to be lavishly tortured and then be executed. Montaigne, religion's surest foundation is the contempt for life. Fear leads to superstition, the big C, though seems mercifully to have dumped, and I'm glad nobody wants to slaughter any endangered species on my behalf. Only okay if I say something objective and stoical. Ian remarking that a time might come when I'd have to let go. Carol asking about Rebecca's wedding. Are you afraid you won't see England again? Also, ordinary expressions like expiration date. Will I outlive my Amex? My driver's license. People say, I'm in town on Friday. Will you be around? What a question. Cold feet, so far only on at night. Peripheral neuropathy is another of those words like necrotic that describe death in life of the system. And you lose weight, but cancer isn't interested in eating your flab. It wants your muscle. The Tumor Town diet ain't much help. Worst of all, it's chemo brain, dull, stuporous. What if the protracted lavish torture is only the prelude to a gruesome execution? Body turns from the reliable friend to more neutral to treacherous foe. Proest? If I convert, it's because it's better that a believer dies than an atheist does. Holy crap. Not even a race for a cure. Paperwork. The curse of Tumor Town. Misery of seeing oneself in old videos on YouTube's. Gradual disclosure. Not yet a problem for me. Michael Korda's book, Man to Man. You can get so habituated to bad news that good news is like Breitenbach and the cake. Consolations of saying, well, at least now I won't have to do that. Larkin Good on fear is in Aubade with implied reproof to Hume and Lucretius for their stoicism. Fair enough in one way, atheists ought not to be offering consolation either. Banality of cancer, entire pest house of side effects, special of the day. See Szymborska's poem on torture and the body as a reservoir for pain. From Alan Lightman's intricate 1993 novel Einstein's Dreams, set in Bern in 1905. With infinite life comes an infinite list of relatives. Grandparents never die, nor do great grandparents, great aunts, and so on, back through the generations, all alive and offering advice. Sons never escape from the shadows of their fathers, nor do daughters of their mothers. No one ever comes into his own. Such is the cost of immortality. No person is whole. No person is free. End of book. Afterword by Carol Blue. On stage, my husband was an impossible act to follow. If you ever saw him at the podium, you may not share Richard Dawkins' assessment that he was the greatest orator of our time, but you will know what I mean, or at least you won't think she would say that. She's his wife. Offstage, my husband was an impossible act to follow. At home, at one of the raucous, joyous, impromptu 8-hour dinners we often found ourselves hosting, where the table was so crammed with ambassadors, hacks, political dissidents, college students, and children that elbows were colliding, and it was hard to find the space to put down a glass of wine. My husband would rise to give a toast that could go on for a stirring, spellbinding, hysterically funny 20 minutes of poetry and limerick reciting, a call to arms for a cause and jokes. How good is it to be us, he would say in his perfect voice. My husband is an impossible act to follow, and yet now I must follow him. I have been forced to have the last word. It was a sort of early summer evening in New York when all you can think of is living. It was June 18th, 2010 to be exact, the first day of his American book tour. I ran as fast as I could down East 93rd Street, suffused with joy and excitement at the sight of seeing him in his white suit. He was dazzling. He was also dying, though we didn't know it yet. And we wouldn't know it for certain until the day of his death. Earlier that day, he had taken a detour from his book launch to a hospital because he thought he was having a heart attack. By that time, I saw him standing at a stage entrance of 92nd Street Y that evening, and he and I, and we alone, knew he might have cancer. We embraced in a shadow that only he saw and chose to defy. We were euphoric. He lifted me up, and we laughed. We went into the theater, where he conquered yet another audience. We managed to get through a jubilant dinner in his honor and set out on a stroll back to our hotel room through the perfect Manhattan night, walking more than 50 blocks. Everything was as it should be, except that it wasn't. We were living in two worlds. The old one, which never seemed more beautiful, had not yet vanished, and the new one, about which we knew little except to fear it, had not yet arrived. The new world lasted 19 months. During this time of what he called living dyingly, he insisted ferociously on living, and his constitution, physical and philosophical, did all it could to stay alive. Christopher was aiming to be among the 5 to 20% of those who could be cured. The odds depended on what doctor we talked to and how they interpreted the scans. Without ever deceiving himself about his medical condition and without ever allowing me to entertain illusions about the prospects for survival, he responded to every bit of clinical statistical good news with radical childlike hope. His will to keep his existence intact, to remain engaged with his preternatural intensity was spectacular. Thanksgiving was his favorite holiday, and I watched with awe as he organized, even as he was sick from the effects of chemotherapy, a grand family gathering in Toronto with all his children and his father-in-law on the eve of an important debate with Tony Blair about religion. This was an occasion orchestrated by a man who told me in the hotel suite that night that this would probably be his last Thanksgiving. As it happens, there was to be one more Thanksgiving. Not long before, back in Washington, on a bright and balmy Indian summer afternoon, he excitedly summoned his family and visiting friends on an outing to see the Origins of Man exhibition at the Museum of Natural History, where I watched him sprint out of the cab and up the granite steps to throw up in a trash can before leading his charges through the out galleries and exuberantly impressing us with the attainments of science and reason. Christopher's charisma never left him, not in any realm, not in public, not in private, not even in the hospital. He made a party of it, transforming the sterile, chilly, neon lighted, humming and beeping and blinking room into a study and a salon. His artful conversation never ceased. The constant interruptions, the poking and prodding, the sample taking, the breathing treatments, the IV bags being changed, nothing kept him from holding court, making a point or an argument, or hitting a punchline for his guests. He listened and drew us out and had us all laughing. He was always asking for and commenting on another newspaper, another magazine, another novel, another review or copy. We stood around his bed and reclined on plastic upholstered chairs as he made us into participants in his Socratic discourses. One night he was coughing up blood and was wheeled into the ICU for a hastily scheduled bronchoscopy. I alternated between watching over him and sleeping in a convertible chair. We lay side by side in our single beds. At one point, we both woke up and started burbling like children at a sleepover party. At the time, this was the best it was going to get. When it came to following the bronchoscopy, after the doctor told him the trouble in his windpipe was not cancer, but rather pneumonia, he was still intubated, but avidly scribbling notes and questions about every conceivable subject. I saved the pages of paper on which he wrote his side of the conversation. There are sweet nothings and a picture he drew on top of the first page, and then pneumonia, what type? Am I cancer free? Pain is hard to remember right now. 4 to 5. He asked after the children and my father. How's Edwin? Tell him I asked. I worry about him, 'cause I love him. I want him. I want to hear him. Slightly down the page, he wrote what he wanted me to bring him from our guest house in Houston. Nietzsche, Mencken, and Chesterton books, plus all random bits of paper, maybe in one hold all bag. Look in the drawers, bedsides, etc., up and downstairs. That night, a dear family friend arrived from New York and was in the room when, in one of his nocturnal interludes of wakefulness and energy, Christopher flashed in an open, wide smile around the tube still running down his throat, and wrote on his clipboard, I'm staying here in Houston until I'm cured, and then I'm taking our families on a vacation to Bermuda. The next morning, after they took out the tube, I came into his room to find him smiling, his fox-like grin at me. Happy anniversary, he called out. A nurse came in with a small white cake, paper plates, and plastic forks. Another wedding anniversary. We are reading the newspaper on the terrace in our suite in New York hotel. It is a faultless fall day. Our 2-year-old daughter is sitting contentedly beside us, drinking a bottle. She climbs off her chair and squats down, inspecting something on the ground. She pulls the bottle out of her mouth, calls to me, and points to a large and motionless bumblebee. She is alarmed, shaking her head back and forth as if to say, No, no, no. The bee stopped, she says. Then she makes a command, Make it start. Back then, she believed I had the power to reanimate the dead. I don't recall what I said to her about that bee, but what I do recall are the words, Make it start. Christopher then lifted her into his lap and consoled and distracted her with a change of subject and humor, just as he would with all of his children so many years later when he was ill. I miss his perfect voice. I heard it day and night, night and day. I missed the first happy trills when he woke, the low octaves of his morning voice as he read me snippets from the newspaper that outraged or amused him, the delighted and irritated, mostly irritated, registers as I interrupted him while he read the jazz tone riffs on him like talking down the line to a radio station from the kitchen phone as he cooked lunch. His chirping, high note greeting when our daughter came home from school, his last soothing pianismo chatterings on retiring late at night. I miss, as his readers must, his writer's voice. His voice on the page. I miss the unpublished hitch, the countless notes he left for me in the entryway on my pillow, the emails he would send while we sat in different rooms in our apartment or in our place in California, and the emails he sent when he was on the road. And I miss his handwritten communiques, his innumerable letters and postcards. We date back to the time of the epistle, and his faxes, the thrill of receiving Christopher's instant dispatches as he's checked in from a dicey spot on some other continent. The first time Christopher went public and wrote about his illness for Vanity Fair, he was ambivalent about it. He was intent on protecting our family's privacy. He was living the topic, and he didn't want it to become all-encompassing. He didn't want to be defined by it. He wanted to think and write in a sphere apart from his sickness. He had made a pact with his editor and chum, Graydon Carter, that he would write about anything except sports, and he kept that promise. He had often put himself in the frame, but now he was the ultimate subject of the story. His last words of the unfinished fragmentary jottings at the end of this little book may seem to trail off, but in fact, they were written on his computer in bursts of energy and enthusiasm as he sat in the hospital using food trays for a desk. When he was admitted to the hospital for the last time, we thought it would be for a brief stay. We all thought, he'd have a chance to write the longer book that was forming in his mind. His intellectual curiosity was sparked by genomics and the cutting-edge proton radiation treatments he underwent, and he was encouraged by the prospect that his case could contribute to future medical breakthroughs. He told an editor friend waiting for an article, "Sorry for the delay. I'll be back home soon." He told me he couldn't wait to catch up on all the movies he had missed and to see the King Tut exhibition in Houston, our temporary residence. The end was unexpected. At home in Washington, I pull books off the shelves, out of the book towers, on the floor, off the stacks of the volumes on the tables. Inside the back covers are notes written in his hand that he took for reviews and for himself. Piles of his papers and notes lie on surfaces all around the apartment, some of which were taken from his suitcase that I brought back from Houston. At any time, I can peruse our library or his notes and rediscover and recover him. When I do, I hear him, and he has the last word. Time after time, Christopher has the last word. June 12th, Washington, D.C. About the author. Christopher Hitchens was born April 13th, 1949, in England and graduated from Balliol College at Oxford University. The father of three children, he was the author of more than 20 books and pamphlets, including collections of essays, criticisms, and reportage. His book, God is Not Great: How Religion Poisons Everything, was a finalist for the 2007 National Book Award and an international bestseller. His best-selling memoir, Hitch 22, was a finalist for the 2010 National Book Critics Critical Award for autobiography. His 2011 best-selling omnibus of selected essays, arguably, was named by the New York Times as one of the 10 best books of the year. A visiting professor of liberal studies at the New School in New York City, he was also the I.F. Stone Professor at Graduate School of Journalism at University of California, Berkeley. He was a columnist, a literary critic, and contributing editor to Vanity Fair, The Atlantic Slate, The Times Literary Supplement, The Nation, The New Statesman, World's Affairs, and Free Inquiry, among other publications. He died in Houston on December 15th, 2011. That's it. Thanks, Chris.